Hi, I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. A few weeks ago, I did a video based to show you 3 different ways in which I will take colonies and get them to produce a lot of honey. The Demaree method, where we removed brood from the queen, moved it up to the top of the hive and kept the queen down below. And all of the above the queen excluder here became honey supers. Produced a lot of honey, and if you do this relatively early in the honey flow, you could even do it again. And again, separate the queen from the brood. The purpose of this, separating the queen from the brood, means that the colony, although it's got a huge population now, has had most of its nurse bees moved up the colony away from the queen, thus reducing the urge to swarm in these colonies, yet still producing a whole load of brood and therefore a big field force, therefore a lot of honey. Now, I've seen other versions of this online, and a lot of folks try this way too early. It's got to be done when there is a lot of bees in the colony before you start. And if you're starting with something like this, I would be having 8, maybe 10 to 12 frames of brood in the hive, and probably honey super on the hive full of bees, in order to make sure there's sufficient bees to populate the colony properly when you've done the Demaree split. From there on in, you've got bees everywhere, so you're going to be good. Also the single brood chamber management, also with the double nuke principle. The principles are similar, but the question that arose by many people was, what do you do about this in the winter? How do you take them from being honey producers and get them ready for the winter? Because you're left with colonies here with brood chambers with very little food stores in there. What do you do next? So that's what this video is all about. So let's start with a cleaner piece of paper. So let's take the situation where we have a Demaree, or Demaree, however you want to pronounce it. We've taken our colony, we've got a queen excluder on here. We've got 2 or 3 honey supers on here, and the old brood chamber. Maybe you've got 2, maybe you've got 3 former brood chambers here, all now full of honey. Colony bursting with bees. What do you do with it? You've taken all this honey off, and you now have a single brood chamber. But the problem with it is that it is still usually full of brood. And there may be next to no honey in that box. And so you would probably do this after the honey flow, which I'm going to say, for example, here in Maine, would be the first part of the honey flow would usually finish in mid-July. We may get a fall honey flow, which starts in August and goes into September. You've got to take a judgment call here, because you're going to have a virtually empty brood chamber food store wise. So as soon as you take your honey off the hive, you need to feed this hive. And so whether you do this in the beginning of August or beginning of September, or you could even do it here in Maine at the very beginning of October, but in the very beginning of October, you're gonna have very little time to get that fed. So what you would do, having said that, if you did this during October, you're probably going to have some honey stored here. already, because a brood nest would have contracted by this stage. But here's one option. You take the honey supers off and you immediately feed it. I'd put a 1 or even 2 gallon sugar syrup container with 2 to 1 sugar syrup for the fall. And you just overwinter the hive as a single brood chamber hive. You feed it until this is virtually entirely full. Basically, that's the only part that would have no honey in it or next to no honey in it. You feed it until the brood is mostly gone and all of the frames are backfilled with sugar syrup. And you overwinter it as a single. Alternatively, if you did it a bit earlier in the fall, so this is for late or earlier, sorry. Okay, so you've got your single brood chamber. What you could do, especially if you've got drawn comb, this will not work with foundation. And then you put a second brood chamber back on and you start feeding the heck out of them. 2 to 1 sugar syrup. And gradually, instead of just like this one that gradually becomes full of sugar syrup or honey, this part becomes full of sugar syrup and that becomes sugar syrup. And now you've got a good population of bees with a very strong amount of food for the winter. Now, you can certainly do this because you've shaken out a whole load of bees from these boxes. This box will be bursting with bees in the fall. So you may take the opportunity to get 2 or 3 frames of comb drawn, but I doubt you're going to get more than that. But if you use drawn comb and maybe checkerboard it with foundation and feed the heck out of it, you can get some extra comb drawn that way as well. But be careful, watch that the comb is being drawn. If it's not being drawn, it's either too cold or you don't have enough bees or you're not feeding enough. And so if in doubt, put it all as drawn comb so they can just fill it up. Also, this is a great opportunity as soon as you've done this and the less and less brood you have, get your mite treatments on, that sort of thing. And then come the spring, well, okay, with this hive, you're straight into double brood chamber. In the spring with this hive, you've got an overwintered colony. And as soon as it is warm enough, let's say you've got a few frames of brood here now, and as soon as it's warm enough or you've got a big enough cluster, you put your second brood chamber on. And you get that growing, and now you're ready. Once you've got your honey super on, you're ready to go to your Demaree split once this is filled with brood. So you put your second brood chamber on, and when you've got enough brood in there, and your next honey super is going, and you've got enough bees to fill that as well, you're ready to go back to doing your Demaree. Okay, so that's how I'd overwinter with the Demaree. In terms of single brood chamber, it's basically almost identical. So with your single brood chamber hive, queen excluder, let's say, okay, how have we got it? We've built it up. We've got our second brood chamber here. We've got a couple of honey supers on here. And we can just do exactly the same thing. When we've taken this honey off, we've got a brood chamber here, which is usually pretty darn full of brood. You've got a lot of bees. So if you do it early enough, you can either overwinter it as a single and feed it exactly the same as you would do with the other, with 2 to 1. Or you can have your single and add your next brood chamber on and feed it 2-to-1, just like you did with the Demaree split. And finally, of course, with your double nuke, this, you've got a few options here. Let's say you double nuke and you put your queen excluder on here, and you've got a brood chamber. I usually have a brood chamber or double deep or a couple of honey supers. I've had producing as many as 3 deeps of honey this way. Well, what you're going to do is you're going to have your nukes, and in each of these you can deal with your nukes with exactly the same way. So you can either overwinter your nuke as a nuke, and again, you just feed it. Because remember, as soon as you take this honey off, you've got no food in here, so you've got to get them feeding right away. So be very careful not to let them starve. If you do it 3 or 4 days and there's no honey flow on, you could all of a sudden have them starve to death because they've not got, sometimes there's not a drop of food in that brood chamber. And of course, you're doing this times 2, so you've got 2 nukes, which you're feeding with 2-to-1. Or you've got another option. You can take each nuke and put another nuke on it. Again, I'd use drawn comb, and you go from having your brood chamber there that they will probably, if you've got drawn comb in here, you're gonna want to feed them right away as well with your 2-to-1. And it works the same as that, only 50% the size of that hive. And there's another one. You do that, and instead of putting it into a single, you put it into a deep. You put your 3 frames in there, your 5 frames in there rather, and you have this, and you overwinter this as a single. I would not assume that you can get too deep from a nuke unless you combine those nukes. But remember, you can have a pair of them here. This is just a way of making sure that you can get both nukes through the winter. And if you have time, you can get them to expand. If you don't have time, you can keep them as single 5-frame nukes. So you can have it expand vertically like that, or horizontally like that. You're probably more likely to get them to fill it up by doing it vertically rather than horizontally, but either way, it should work. So there you have it. A lot of people asked, how do I get them through the winter? That's how I would get them through the winter, using the 3 options. So with the Demaree, I'd either, and very commonly, overwinter them as a single deep, but if I do it a little earlier in the fall, I'll overwinter them back, add another deep, and feed it up even more. So it takes a lot of feeding. Sometimes you'll want to put more buckets on. Make sure you don't leave it too late, because once it gets too cold, you're not going to be able to do this. And so usually by middle of October, I can't do feeding anymore. If it's a warm fall, I might be able to feed a little later, but don't assume it. Always work backwards from when you're not going to be able to feed anymore. If you're going back from a double brood chamber to a single brood chamber, like you do with this one, you can, if you do it early enough, get it back to a double to overwinter, or just overwinter as a single. And likewise with the 2 nukes, each one you can either overwinter them as nukes, overwinter them as a 2-story nuke, or build them up to a single and overwinter them that way. I hope that helps. I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. See you next time.